Greetings, everyone. Guess what time it is? Guess what time it is? It is time to discuss that issue that never seems to go away in American society. Yes, that's right. Let's talk about race, baby. Most recently, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this already, the famed British actor Benedict Cumberbatch came under some fire for his use of the term colored to refer to non-white actors in an interview that he recently did on the Tavish Smiley show on PBS. Now, Mr. Cumberbatch was actually making a very laudable point, which is that in British show business specifically, there often aren't enough opportunities for folks whom he called colored actors, namely actors who are anything but Caucasian. And he remarked that many black actors in particular from the UK have found much greater opportunities for success here in the United States. Now, as we all know, America and its film industry have their own issues with race, but I thought it was really interesting to hear a white British actor go out of his way to acknowledge challenges that non-white actors face in a fellow Western society, in Europe, in Western Europe, which is often thought by many Americans to be much more open-minded and progressive when it comes to these kinds of issues and many other issues. It was interesting to hear him talking about the greater opportunities that exist for actors, for non-white or non-Caucasian actors here in America vis-a-vis the United Kingdom. So, Mr. Cumberbatch quickly recognized his error, or perhaps was informed of his error, I'm actually not sure, in using the term colored to refer to non-white actors. And he had the decency to apologize for it profusely and I think sincerely very promptly afterwards. And I think a lot of the criticism that he's gotten has reflected that. It hasn't been too harsh, it hasn't been too hard on him. I think a lot of his critics have been willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and cut him some slack, which I think he deserves. So all's well that ends well, but I think that this incident raises some interesting questions. I think it raises two particularly interesting issues. First of all, the prevalence of problems surrounding race and ethnicity in various societies rather than just here in the United States, and the importance of putting the problems that exist in each country in their proper perspective, their proper global perspective, that is. The second issue I think that this incident raises that's worth discussing is terminology itself, politically correct nomenclature itself, and whether if a term like colored is considered inappropriate, whether other terms that are very similar should not also be considered inappropriate. So to dive into that first issue, I just think it's very eye-opening that you have someone in Mr. Cumberbatch's position acknowledging the problems that non-white actors face in show business in the UK. Now, coming from Canada here to the United States, I've found that a lot of Americans have a perception that race is America's problem, and that few, if any, other societies struggle with it in quite the way or to quite the extent that the United States does. And so you end up, I've met a pretty many Americans with whom I've conversed, especially once they find out that I'm Canadian, who seem to think that there's little or no racism or related prejudice in Canada. And I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised to find that many of those same people labor under that same misconception when it comes to other societies, other Western democratic societies such as the UK. If anyone watching this labors under those misconceptions, then let me put paid to them and put them to rest right now. I assure you there is definitely plenty of racial prejudice in other societies such as Canada and the UK. I've never been across the pond myself, but having grown up in Canada and subsequently having done all of my higher education here in the United States and having lived here for the past 5 years or so, I can assure you that there is countries like Canada have plenty of their own fair share of racial prejudice and problems in the society that stem from that. Speaking from my own personal experience, I can tell you I have yet to be called by the word nigger here in the United States. That hasn't happened to me on this side of the 49th parallel as of yet. It has happened to me in Canada. Not very many times, but a few times throughout my life, growing up in Montreal. I came under that kind of racist fire, and interestingly enough, it has yet to happen to me here in the U.S. And you shouldn't chalk that up to the fact that so far I've lived in New Jersey, New York City, and Washington, D.C., because there's plenty of that kind of racism in these parts of the United States as well, and not only in, places like Alabama or Colorado or what have you. Places in more the heartland or perhaps the hinterland of the United States. There's plenty of that kind of prejudice to go around in the more supposedly urbane and enlightened, progressive parts of the country as well. So that's just something that I think Americans of all backgrounds and of all political orientations and mindsets should keep in mind. Racial problems are not something that only afflict the United States. They afflict a number of different societies. And if you find that some societies are less obsessed with race than American society is, you have to look at the history of these different countries. The United States has had a black population, substantial black population, since centuries before it even became a country, obviously due to the institution of slavery. Let's not forget that America more or less inherited the institution of slavery from the European empires that colonized these territories before the U.S. came into being as a country. Mainly the British, but also to varying degrees the French, the Spaniards, and the Dutch. So let's not forget that we should expect racial problems of one kind or another to crop up in a lot of these other societies as well. If you look at the way the racial breakdowns work in these different countries, I think it also becomes clear why there might be more opportunities for black actors, for example, in the United States than there would be in a country like the United Kingdom. At the end of the day, like I said a moment ago, the black population in this country is every bit as indigenous to this country as the white population is, which is to say not really indigenous at all, but certainly no further from indigeneity than the white population. You've heard the slogan that America is a nation of immigrants. It's not strictly a nation of immigrants because, by and large, the African American story is not an immigrant story. It's not the story of people who chose to come to America to build a better life. It's the story of people who are descended from slaves who were brought to America against their will. As Malcolm X has supposedly once said, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. But you see, because such a substantial portion of the U.S. population is black and descended from American slaves, and of course, since racial problems have dominated so much of this country's history and politics, Americans give attention to racial issues in a way and to a degree that you might not see in other countries, such as the United Kingdom, or Canada for that matter. And even when racial issues are given a lot of attention in those other societies, you might not find the same amount of attention being paid to issues that affect the black community in particular, for example, right? So the black community in Britain, since British slavery was generally practiced in Britain's colonies, hundreds of miles away from the mother country, you didn't see substantial populations of black people in the UK itself until after World War II. And these were immigrants to the United Kingdom. You can't say that in the United States. And of course, blacks make up roughly, I think, between 11 and 13% of the American population. I'm not sure what the exact population share is in Britain, but I'm sure it's much lower than that, right? And so you'll find, I think it's natural, if only for structural reasons, maybe I shouldn't say natural, but unsurprising, if only for structural reasons, that you would find a lot fewer opportunities in British society for black actors and actresses to make their mark than you would find in America. I think that's something that should be taken into account because, we hear a lot of complaints in America about how black actors and actresses get the short end of the stick. And I'm not saying that those complaints are unfounded. I think they are to a large degree. However, let's not forget, and this is what I mean when I say, we need to put these issues in perspective. Let's not forget that there are still a great many opportunities for black folks in show business in this country. And, in many cases, America has a great many more such opportunities to offer than we would be able to enjoy in most other countries in the world, frankly, other than countries that are predominantly black. Certainly in most other industrialized democratic countries, we would probably have far fewer opportunities than even Hollywood is willing to afford us. So I think that's something we should keep in mind, and we should always do our best to take advantage of the opportunities that we do have available to us in a country like America. Second of all, there's the issue of political correctness and terminology. Now, as I mentioned in a discussion I had with some Facebook friends a few weeks ago, I actually don't use the term people of color. Now, many of the folks who criticized Benedict Cumberbatch for using the term colored people themselves used the more modern and politically correct term people of color as a substitute for it. Now, the societal consensus is that the term people of color is totally legitimate. Personally, I don't have any use for it. I don't see any meaningful semantic distinction between colored people and people of color. I don't see what good it does to take those words and reverse them, the words colored people, and reverse them and add a preposition in between them, in order to sanitize the term or to make it more acceptable. So given that there's really barely any semantic distinction between the two terms, and whatever distinction might exist, I think is pretty meaningless. I don't see why we should regard the term people of color as acceptable if we regard the term colored people as unacceptable. Now, I understand that the two terms have very different histories, and one term has its roots in white supremacy, whereas the other term has its roots in resistance to white supremacy. I'm well aware of that. I'm not oblivious to that reality at all. Nonetheless, I think that words do have intrinsic meanings. And I think that when we're evaluating different terms to determine which ones are going to be acceptable and which ones aren't, we should not only look at those kinds of factors, such as the motivations of the people who devised the different terms, but we should look at the intrinsic definitions and meanings of those words as well, and take those factors into account when we're deciding what terms are acceptable and which ones aren't. When I apply that kind of analysis to a term like people of color, the conclusion I come away with is that there's no good reason to use that term and regard it as PC if we're going to regard a term like colored people as politically incorrect. What's more, again, along the lines of considering the inherent meanings of these words, I don't think the term people of color makes any sense, because all human beings have at least some color in their skin, right? I mean, it's not as if Europeans and European descendants, white people in other words, don't have any melanin or any color in their skin. They just have lower concentrations of melanin than darker skinned peoples like myself have. If I'm not mistaken, and don't quote me on this because I might be wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, even albinos have at least some melanin concentrations in their skin. So given that reality of pigmentation, I don't see the point. I don't see what sense it makes to use a term like people of color to refer to everyone other than Europeans and European descendants. The term I prefer to use is non-white, or I might say non-Caucasian. Now, I understand that those terms are controversial because they sort of risk basing the identities of non-white peoples on our relationship to whites. I understand that criticism, but at the end of the day, if we're talking about non-white populations in countries like the United States that still, for the time being, have majority white populations, I don't think there's any getting around the fact that we are in the minority, and I don't think there's any getting around, just the fact that much of our destiny, to a large degree, has been in the hands of Europeans and European descendant peoples. It's an unfortunate aspect of history, but it's the way history has played out. I don't see much use in sort of airbrushing that uncomfortable fact out of our consciousness, our collective consciousness, by sanitizing language in that way, by choosing language that overlooks or papers over those unpleasant aspects of our racial history. What's more, when it comes to a term like people of color, again, I think the fact that the term is inaccurate on when it comes to the pigment in our skin on a literal level, the term simply just does not stand up to factual scrutiny, I think that outweighs the question of, whether we should change our terminology to avoid defining non-white peoples in relation to whites. I'm not sure that we should seek to airbrush history in that way for our own good as non-white communities, and I don't think that that's good for the society as a whole. And at the end of the day, I just don't think it makes any sense. I don't think it's accurate to use a term like people of color. So you won't generally hear me using that term. You'll hear me saying non-white, you'll hear me saying non-Caucasian, perhaps non-European or non-European descendant. As for the term minority, which is also controversial in the eyes of many, that's just a factual issue. I mean, if you're referring to groups within a society in which they happen to be numerical minorities, I don't think there should be any problem with referring to those groups as minority groups, because that's what they are. And there's nothing inherently disparaging about acknowledging their minority status within the society. It's just a question of factual accuracy. As a mathematical issue, we're talking about societies in which we are in the minority. I don't think that's something we should run and hide from or seek to sweep under the rug. So those are the issues that this Benedict Cumberbatch Tempest in a Teapot brings to my mind. So again, that's my 2 cents, and feel free to share your own thoughts with me wherever you see me post this video. Thanks a lot, and see you soon. Later.